In the autumn of 1821, in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Bristol, England, a 7-year-old boy named Edwin Marlowe began speaking words that no one in his household could understand. His mother, a seamstress named Margaret, first heard the strange sounds while preparing breakfast on a cold October morning. The boy sat at the wooden table, his eyes vacant and distant, producing a stream of fluid, structured speech that seemed to follow grammatical patterns yet corresponded to no language anyone in Bristol had ever encountered. Margaret initially believed her son was playing an elaborate game, perhaps mimicking the foreign sailors who occasionally passed through the port. But as hours turned to days, and days stretched into weeks, the unsettling reality became impossible to ignore. Edwin spoke this unknown tongue with perfect fluency, yet seemed unable to recall a single word of English. The transformation had occurred overnight, without warning, without illness, without any discernible cause. Within a fortnight, news of the speaking boy had spread through Bristol's narrow streets, reaching the ears of clergymen, physicians, and scholars who arrived at the Marlowe cottage with notebooks, skepticism, and an unshakable curiosity about what they were about to witness. The early 19th century was a period of profound intellectual awakening in Britain, yet also one of deep superstition and religious anxiety. The year 1821 fell squarely within the Georgian era, a time when the boundaries between scientific inquiry and spiritual interpretation remained frustratingly blurred. Medical understanding of the human mind was primitive at best. Physicians still believed in the four humors, attributing mental disturbances to imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Asylums across England were filled with individuals deemed mad, subjected to treatments that ranged from bloodletting to cold water immersion, from restraints to isolation. The concept of psychology as we understand it today did not exist. Instead, the mind was viewed through a lens of moral philosophy and religious doctrine. Possession by malevolent spirits remained a commonly accepted explanation for aberrant behavior, particularly among the working classes. The Church of England held tremendous sway over public opinion, and any phenomenon that defied easy explanation was quickly subjected to theological scrutiny. Against this backdrop, Edwin Marlowe's case represented something far more disturbing than a medical curiosity. It was a direct challenge to the ordered universe that both science and religion claimed to understand. Dr. Cornelius Webb, a physician with a particular interest in diseases of the nervous system, was among the first to examine the boy. His written account, preserved in the archives of the Bristol Medical Society, provides an unnerving glimpse into those initial encounters. Webb described Edwin as physically healthy, with clear eyes, steady pulse, and no signs of fever or infection. The boy's motor functions appeared entirely normal. He could dress himself, eat without assistance, and respond to visual cues and gestures. Yet the moment he attempted verbal communication, something incomprehensible emerged. Webb noted that the language possessed distinct phonetic patterns, with recurring syllables and what appeared to be consistent grammatical structures. It was not gibberish, not the random utterances of a damaged mind. It was language, but language with no identifiable origin. Webb attempted to trace similarities to known tongues. He consulted with colleagues familiar with Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and various European languages. He even brought in a merchant who had traded extensively in the Ottoman Empire, hoping to detect traces of Turkish or Arabic. Every attempt ended in failure. The sounds Edwin produced matched nothing in any documented linguistic tradition. How could a 7-year-old child, born and raised in Bristol, never having traveled beyond the city's limits, suddenly speak a language that appeared to exist nowhere on earth? The religious community responded with predictable alarm. Reverend Thomas Ashford of St. Mary Redcliffe Church visited the Marlowe home on 3 separate occasions, each time growing more troubled by what he observed. In a letter to the Bishop of Bristol, Ashford described Edwin's speech as disturbingly coherent, suggesting an intelligence behind the words that may not be the child's own. He stopped short of explicitly declaring possession, but the implication hung heavy in his carefully chosen phrases. Ashford noted that Edwin seemed untroubled by his condition, showing no distress at his inability to communicate with his family. The boy appeared content, almost serene, as though the strange language was his natural state and English was the aberration. This peculiar calmness deeply unsettled those who witnessed it. Possession, in the theological understanding of the time, was typically accompanied by visible suffering, violent outbursts, or evidence of spiritual torment. Edwin exhibited none of these symptoms. He was simply a child speaking an impossible language with the ease and confidence of a native speaker. Could a 7-year-old truly fabricate such an elaborate deception? And if not deception, then what explanation remained? Margaret Marlowe, desperate to reclaim her son from whatever had taken hold of him, sought help from multiple sources. She brought Edwin to Dr. Richard Fowler, another prominent Bristol physician known for treating nervous disorders. Fowler's approach differed from Webb's. Rather than attempting to identify the language, he sought to understand the mechanism of the transformation. He questioned Margaret extensively about the days and hours preceding the change. Had Edwin suffered any injury, even a minor fall? Had he experienced nightmares or exhibited unusual behavior? Had he been exposed to any strangers or unusual situations? Margaret's answers painted a picture of perfect normalcy. Edwin had been a typical child, perhaps quieter than most, but otherwise unremarkable. The night before the transformation, he had eaten dinner with the family, said his prayers, and gone to bed without incident. The following morning, English had simply vanished from his repertoire, replaced entirely by the unknown tongue. Fowler documented his observations with meticulous care, noting that Edwin's tongue, lips, and throat showed no physical abnormalities that might account for altered speech patterns. The boy's hearing appeared unaffected. He could clearly perceive sounds and responded appropriately to nonverbal communication. Whatever had occurred, it had not damaged Edwin's physical capacity for language. It had instead replaced one linguistic system with another, completely and instantaneously. News of Edwin Marlowe spread beyond Bristol by December of 1821, reaching London and capturing the attention of the city's intellectual circles. The case was discussed in drawing rooms, debated in medical societies, and referenced in private correspondence between scholars. Sir William Chambers, a linguist and member of the Royal Society, traveled to Bristol to personally investigate. Chambers possessed knowledge of dozens of languages, both living and dead. He had studied Sanskrit, Persian, and various African and Asian tongues during his travels. His examination of Edwin lasted 3 full days, during which he recorded extensive samples of the boy's speech, noting pronunciation, intonation, and what he believed to be grammatical patterns. In his report to the Royal Society, Chambers made a startling admission. The language Edwin spoke was not only unidentifiable but possessed structural features that seemed internally consistent and sophisticated. It was not a pidgin or a child's invented play language. It exhibited complexity comparable to established languages, with what appeared to be verb conjugations, noun declensions, and syntactic rules. Chambers concluded that if Edwin had somehow invented this language himself, the boy possessed a linguistic genius unprecedented in recorded history. But Chambers also acknowledged a more unsettling possibility. What if Edwin had not invented the language at all? What if he was simply channeling something that already existed, something beyond the reach of contemporary understanding? The social implications of Edwin's condition created significant hardship for the Marlowe family. Margaret's seamstress business suffered as neighbors grew increasingly uncomfortable with the strange child in their midst. Some viewed Edwin with superstitious fear, crossing themselves when they passed the cottage, whispering about curses and dark forces. Others dismissed the entire affair as an elaborate hoax, accusing Margaret of coaching her son to produce nonsensical sounds for attention or financial gain. A few local newspapers picked up the story, though their coverage ranged from sensationalist speculation to outright mockery. The Bristol Mercury published an account in late December that questioned whether the case represented genuine mystery or mere parental delusion. The article suggested that Edwin might be suffering from a form of selective mutism, choosing not to speak English rather than being unable to do so. But this explanation failed to account for the complexity and consistency of the alternative language he employed. Selective mutism typically results in silence, not the spontaneous production of structured, rule-governed speech. The Marlowes found themselves trapped between scientific curiosity and social ostracism, their son transformed into a living enigma that defied every attempt at rational explanation. By early 1822, Edwin had been speaking the unknown language for nearly 4 months. During this period, several attempts were made to teach him English again, as though he were a child learning language for the first time. Margaret sat with him daily, pointing to objects and speaking their names slowly and clearly. Edwin watched with apparent interest but made no attempt to repeat the English words. Instead, he would respond in his mysterious tongue, sometimes gesturing toward the same objects, perhaps offering the words in his language for the items his mother identified. Dr. Webb began to suspect that Edwin retained comprehension of English even if he could not produce it. Simple tests seemed to confirm this hypothesis. When asked in English to retrieve an object from another room, Edwin would comply correctly, suggesting that he understood the instruction even though he could not verbally acknowledge it in English. This partial preservation of linguistic function puzzled the physicians. If Edwin understood English but could only speak in the unknown language, what did that reveal about the nature of his condition? Was it a problem of linguistic production rather than comprehension? Or was something more complex at work, something that allowed certain pathways of understanding to remain intact while completely blocking others? The winter of 1822 brought a new development that deepened the mystery surrounding Edwin Marlowe. A traveling scholar named Edmund Voss, who had spent years in the remotest regions of Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, arrived in Bristol after hearing rumors of the case. Voss had dedicated his life to documenting obscure dialects and nearly extinct languages spoken by isolated communities. His collection of linguistic samples was among the most comprehensive in private hands. When Voss first heard Edwin speak, he became visibly agitated. After several hours of careful listening, Voss made a claim that sent shockwaves through the assembled physicians and scholars. He insisted that certain phonetic elements in Edwin's speech bore striking similarities to fragments of a language he had encountered in the Carpathian Mountains, spoken by a small, insular community that claimed descent from a people who predated recorded history in the region. The comparison was not exact, Voss admitted, but the resemblances were too specific to dismiss as coincidence. The question immediately arose: how could a 7-year-old boy from Bristol produce sounds related to an obscure dialect spoken by an isolated group thousands of miles away, in a region he had never visited and likely never heard of? Voss himself acknowledged the impossibility of any conventional explanation. Margaret Marlowe was a lifelong resident of Bristol. Edwin's father, a laborer who had died 2 years earlier, had never traveled beyond the English countryside. There was no conceivable way the boy could have been exposed to this Carpathian dialect. Voss's claims were met with immediate skepticism from some quarters. Several scholars argued that the similarities he detected were superficial, the result of observer bias or wishful thinking. Languages often share phonetic features by chance, they insisted, and finding coincidental resemblances between unrelated tongues was not unusual. But Voss remained adamant. He spent weeks with Edwin, recording extensive samples and comparing them against his notes from the Carpathian research. He documented specific sound combinations, particular intonation patterns, and what he believed were shared structural elements. In a detailed written account, Voss described the Carpathian community he had visited in 1818. They lived in extreme isolation, maintaining traditions and a language that bore no clear relationship to the Slavic tongues surrounding them. The villagers told Voss that their language was ancient, predating the migrations and conquests that shaped Eastern Europe. They claimed their ancestors had spoken this tongue for thousands of years, preserving it against the erosive forces of cultural change. Voss had been fascinated but skeptical of such claims, viewing them as common mythologizing of linguistic heritage. Yet now, listening to Edwin Marlowe speak in Bristol in 1822, he found himself confronting the possibility that those village elders had been telling the truth. If their language truly was ancient, and if Edwin was somehow producing related sounds, what mechanism could possibly explain the connection? The psychological dimensions of Edwin's case began to attract attention from physicians interested in the relationship between mind and behavior. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, an early pioneer in what would eventually become psychiatry, examined Edwin in March of 1822. Pritchard approached the case with a hypothesis rooted in the emerging understanding of unconscious mental processes. He wondered whether Edwin might have been exposed to the foreign language at some point in his early childhood, perhaps before his conscious memory formed, and that this buried linguistic knowledge had somehow been triggered by an unknown event. This theory, while creative, faced immediate problems. Margaret insisted that Edwin had never been exposed to foreign languages. The family did not travel, did not associate with immigrants or foreign visitors, and lived in a part of Bristol largely isolated from the international commerce of the port. Pritchard's theory also failed to explain why such deeply buried memories would completely supplant English rather than coexisting with it. Nevertheless, Pritchard's examination revealed something intriguing. When he showed Edwin pictures of various scenes, landscapes, buildings, groups of people, the boy would sometimes become animated, speaking rapidly in the unknown language and pointing to specific elements in the images. Pritchard noted that Edwin seemed to be describing or responding to the pictures, suggesting that the language was not merely rote reproduction but was being actively used for communication and expression. This observation supported the growing consensus that whatever Edwin was speaking, it functioned as a genuine language with semantic content and communicative intent. As months passed, the initial fervor surrounding Edwin's case began to wane. The physicians and scholars who had crowded the Marlowe cottage in the winter gradually returned to their usual pursuits, having exhausted their investigative approaches without reaching any satisfying conclusion. Margaret attempted to rebuild some semblance of normal life, though Edwin's condition remained unchanged. The boy continued speaking exclusively in the unknown tongue, seemingly content in his linguistic isolation. By the summer of 1822, fewer visitors came to observe him. The case had become, in the eyes of many, an unsolvable mystery, perhaps even an elaborate deception that had fooled too many educated men. Yet a small group of dedicated researchers continued their investigations, unwilling to abandon what they viewed as one of the most profound enigmas they had ever encountered. Dr. Webb maintained regular contact with the family, documenting any changes or developments. Sir William Chambers continued analyzing his recorded samples, comparing them against every linguistic text he could access. Edmund Voss prepared a comprehensive treatise arguing for the connection between Edwin's speech and the Carpathian dialect, though he struggled to explain the mechanism that could produce such a connection. The case of Edwin Marlowe had become a touchstone for fundamental questions about language, memory, consciousness, and the boundaries of human knowledge. In September of 1822, nearly a year after the transformation began, something unexpected occurred. Margaret reported to Dr. Webb that Edwin had spoken a single word in English. The word was "Mother," uttered quietly one evening as the boy prepared for bed. Margaret, stunned, had tried to encourage more English speech, but Edwin had immediately reverted to the unknown language. Over the following weeks, sporadic English words began to emerge, always isolated, always brief, like fragments of a submerged reality breaking through to the surface. The English words seemed to cause Edwin some distress, as though producing them required great effort or created internal conflict. Dr. Webb theorized that whatever mechanism had blocked English was beginning to weaken, allowing partial restoration of Edwin's original linguistic capacity. But why would such restoration be slow and fragmentary rather than complete? If the transformation had occurred instantly, why would its reversal proceed in gradual, halting steps? These questions took on new urgency as Edwin's family and the observing physicians wondered whether the boy might eventually return to normal or whether he would remain trapped between two languages, fully fluent in neither. The phenomenon of sudden linguistic transformation was not entirely without historical precedent, though cases were rare and poorly documented. Medieval chronicles occasionally mentioned individuals who began speaking in unknown tongues, often interpreted as miracles, curses, or symptoms of divine possession. The concept of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, had deep roots in Christian tradition, particularly in charismatic and Pentecostal movements, though such religious speech typically lacked the grammatical structure evident in Edwin's case. More relevant were scattered accounts from medical literature of patients who, following head injuries or severe illnesses, had experienced dramatic changes in speech patterns. Some developed foreign accent syndrome, a condition where brain trauma altered pronunciation enough to make native speakers sound as though they had acquired a foreign accent. But Edwin had suffered no injury, no illness, no trauma that might explain a neurological change. His transformation had occurred spontaneously during sleep, without any precipitating event. This lack of obvious causation made his case particularly maddening for those seeking a rational explanation. In science, effects require causes. Edwin's condition seemed to violate this fundamental principle, presenting an effect without any discernible cause. By late 1822, theories about Edwin's condition had proliferated far beyond the medical and scientific communities. Spiritualists and believers in supernatural phenomena seized upon the case as evidence of contact with otherworldly realms. Some proposed that Edwin was channeling the spirits of ancient peoples, giving voice to languages long vanished from the earth. Others suggested that the boy had somehow accessed inherited memories, ancestral knowledge passed down through bloodlines in ways that science could not yet detect or understand. These ideas, while dismissed by most educated observers as fanciful speculation, resonated with a public hungry for mystery and uncomfortable with purely materialist explanations. The Romantic movement, then at its height, had cultivated a cultural appetite for the sublime, the inexplicable, the numinous. Edwin Marlowe, with his innocent face and impossible language, became a symbol of everything that modernity could not explain, a living reminder that the universe retained secrets beyond the reach of reason and empirical investigation. Whether this symbolic status helped or harmed the boy and his family remained an open question. It certainly ensured that Edwin's story would not be forgotten, even as the specifics of his case grew increasingly embellished and distorted through retelling. The practical challenges facing the Marlowe family intensified as Edwin's condition persisted. The boy required education, but conventional schooling proved impossible. No teacher could instruct a child who could not communicate in English, at least not with any consistency. Margaret attempted to educate Edwin herself, teaching him to read and write in English despite his inability to speak it fluently. To the surprise of everyone involved, Edwin demonstrated an aptitude for written English that his spoken language suggested he should not possess. He could read simple texts and, with effort, could write basic sentences, though his written expression remained limited compared to what would be expected of a child his age. This dissociation between spoken and written language added yet another layer of complexity to an already bewildering case. It suggested that Edwin's condition affected speech production specifically while leaving other language-related cognitive functions relatively intact. Dr. Webb noted this observation with great interest, recognizing that it might provide clues about the neural mechanisms underlying language. But in 1822, neuroscience did not exist as a discipline. The brain remained a largely mysterious organ, its functions poorly understood. The tools and techniques necessary to investigate such questions would not be developed for more than a century. If you enjoy uncovering stories lost in darkness, don't forget to subscribe to Withered Truths and leave a like. By 1823, Edwin Marlowe had been living with his mysterious condition for more than 2 years. The gradual re-emergence of English continued, but his fluency in the unknown language showed no signs of diminishing. He had become, in effect, bilingual, though one of his languages remained unidentified and possibly unidentifiable. Dr. Webb documented that Edwin could now switch between English and the unknown tongue with apparent intentionality, though the boy seemed to prefer the latter, particularly when expressing complex thoughts or emotions. This preference raised intriguing questions. If Edwin found the unknown language more natural or comfortable for certain types of expression, did that suggest it was somehow more fundamental to his consciousness than English? Or was this preference simply the result of having spent formative developmental time immersed in the alternative linguistic system? The relationship between language and thought had long fascinated philosophers. Some argued that language shaped thought, determining the categories and concepts through which individuals understood reality. Others maintained that thought preceded language, existing in some prelinguistic form that words merely expressed. Edwin's case seemed to offer a unique opportunity to explore these questions, but the absence of any way to translate or understand his unknown language made such exploration frustratingly difficult. Contemporary accounts from 1823 reveal growing frustration among the researchers who had invested so much time in Edwin's case. Letters between Webb, Chambers, and other involved parties expressed disappointment at the lack of progress and concern that the case might ultimately yield no useful insights. Chambers, in particular, seemed troubled by his failure to identify the language. He had spent hundreds of hours analyzing his recordings and comparing them against every linguistic source available to him. If the language truly had no connection to any known tongue, he wrote, then its origin remained one of the most profound mysteries he had ever encountered. But Chambers also acknowledged the possibility that he had simply failed to find the right comparison, that somewhere in the vast diversity of human languages, a match existed that he had overlooked. The world in 1823 was far less documented and interconnected than it would later become. Vast regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas remained unexplored by European scholars. Countless languages existed in isolation, known only to their speakers, unrecorded and unstudied. Perhaps Edwin's language belonged to one of these undocumented systems. But this explanation, while possible, required an additional leap, explaining how Edwin could have acquired such a language without any apparent exposure to its speakers. The case took an unexpected turn in the spring of 1823 when a merchant named Jacob Hartwell contacted Dr. Webb with an extraordinary claim. Hartwell had recently returned from an extended trading expedition to the South Pacific, where he had spent time on various remote islands. During his travels, he had encountered an elderly indigenous man who spoke a language that Hartwell swore bore similarities to the sounds he had read about in newspaper accounts of Edwin Marlowe. Hartwell had not recorded the language in any systematic way, and his claims were based on memory and impressions rather than careful analysis. Nevertheless, Webb felt obligated to investigate. He arranged for Hartwell to meet Edwin and, if possible, to reproduce some of the sounds he remembered from the South Pacific. The meeting took place in May of 1823, with several witnesses present. Hartwell attempted to mimic phrases he recalled, and Edwin's reaction was immediate and striking. The boy became intensely animated, speaking rapidly in his unknown language and gesturing excitedly. Margaret Marlowe later described it as the most engaged and responsive she had seen her son in years. Did Edwin recognize something familiar in Hartwell's imperfect reproductions? Or was his excitement merely a response to hearing any sounds that vaguely resembled his own speech after years of linguistic isolation? The meeting ended without clear resolution. Hartwell could not sustain conversation in the language, and his memories were too fragmentary to permit detailed comparison. But his account added another geographical possibility to the growing list of potential origins for Edwin's mysterious tongue. Share in the comments, what country are you in, and what time is it right now? The question of what happened to Edwin Marlowe after 1823 becomes increasingly difficult to answer with certainty. Records of the case become sparse and fragmented, scattered across various archives and private collections. A letter from Margaret Marlowe to Dr. Webb, dated November 1823, mentions that Edwin's English had continued to improve and that the family was attempting to return to as normal a life as possible. There are no further mentions of scientific observations or examinations. It appears that the medical and scholarly community had, for the most part, moved on, unable to extract any definitive answers from the case and perhaps exhausted by its intractability. The absence of detailed records from Edwin's later childhood and adolescence creates a frustrating gap in the narrative. We do not know with certainty whether he ever fully recovered his English, whether the unknown language persisted throughout his life, or how his condition affected his development and social integration. Census records indicate that an Edwin Marlowe, age matching the boy from Bristol, was living in the city in 1831, listed as a clerk. If this is the same individual, it suggests he achieved some level of functional adaptation, able to perform work requiring literacy and communication. But without more detailed biographical information, we cannot know how the strange events of his childhood shaped the course of his life. What the case of Edwin Marlowe ultimately represents remains a subject of interpretation and debate even today. For the physicians and scholars of the 1820s, it was an unsolved mystery that challenged their understanding of language, mind, and human capability. Some concluded that Edwin had experienced a rare and poorly understood neurological event, perhaps a form of aphasia or language disruption that manifested in unusual ways. Others maintained that the case pointed toward unknown dimensions of consciousness or memory, suggesting that human minds might contain hidden capacities or connections that science had yet to discover. The supernatural interpretations, while dismissed by most educated observers, persisted in popular imagination, fueling folklore and speculation about the boy who spoke an impossible language. From a modern perspective, with the benefit of neurological and linguistic knowledge unavailable in the 19th century, several interpretations seem plausible. Edwin might have suffered a rare form of acquired childhood aphasia that disrupted his English while paradoxically producing fluent neologistic jargon, invented speech that mimics the structure and flow of real language without having actual semantic content rooted in any linguistic tradition. Alternatively, if Voss's claims about similarities to the Carpathian dialect had any validity, we might be dealing with an extraordinarily rare case of cryptomnesia, where forgotten or unconscious memories resurface in unexpected ways. Or perhaps Edwin's case was something else entirely, a phenomenon that our current framework still cannot adequately explain. The persistence of mystery surrounding Edwin Marlowe raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of human knowledge and the boundaries of scientific explanation. Every age believes itself more enlightened than its predecessors, more capable of understanding the world through reason and evidence. Yet cases like Edwin's remind us that reality occasionally produces phenomena that resist our best efforts at explanation. The unknown language he spoke was either real or invented, either connected to an existing linguistic tradition or spontaneously generated by a 7-year-old child. Both possibilities strain credibility in different ways. If the language was real, how did Edwin acquire it? If it was invented, how did he create something so complex and consistent? The absence of satisfying answers does not erase the documented observations. Multiple educated witnesses, including physicians, linguists, and scholars, confirmed that Edwin produced structured, rule-governed speech that they could not identify. Their testimony, preserved in letters, medical records, and scholarly reports, forms the foundation of our knowledge about the case. Were they all deceived? Did they collectively misinterpret what they observed? Or did Edwin Marlowe truly speak a language that, by all conventional understanding, should not exist? The story of Edwin Marlowe concludes not with revelation but with absence. The detailed records end in 1823. The boy disappears into the anonymity of ordinary life, or perhaps into death at a young age, common enough in 19th century England that it would not have generated special notice. The scholars and physicians who studied him moved on to other cases, other mysteries. Margaret Marlowe faded from historical record. The cottage in Bristol where the strange events unfolded no longer stands, replaced by modern construction. The only remnants are the written accounts, preserved in archives, fragmentary and incomplete, raising more questions than they answer. We are left with a narrative that defies easy conclusion, a mystery that time has not solved but merely obscured. Edwin Marlowe spoke words that traveled from his lips into the air, were heard by witnesses, and then vanished, leaving no language behind to study, no community of speakers to investigate, no Rosetta Stone to provide translation. He was a singular case, unrepeatable and ultimately unknowable. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of his story, not what it reveals about language or consciousness or the human mind, but what it reveals about the universe itself. That it can produce anomalies so profound that they remain anomalies forever, resistant to explanation, standing as permanent reminders that understanding has limits, and that some questions, once asked, may never receive answers. The boy who spoke a language that shouldn't exist lived briefly in documented history and then vanished, carrying his impossible words with him into silence.